Hello everyone, welcome to the Macho Man Real Estate channel. And I just want to wish y'all a happy President's Day, for this is none other than my presidential tier list video. Now, just to clarify, I already made a presidential tier list last year before I had my YouTube channel. However, I decided I would want to make some changes to this one. And starting out right around here, I will mention that Joe Biden, I will probably have to put, since he is not the same president, since he is currently not finished with his term, I will probably have to put him in not to be judged for now. I mean, do I love Biden? No, but I don't hate him either, though, so I'll just get that out of the way. I will admit there's some things I like about him, like his handling of Ukraine, and I will say as well that at least he has been able to have a good track with the jobs, but there's definitely some things I don't like about Biden, though. I mean, his oration capabilities are very lackluster, and he's clearly past his prime. It's no secret. And you got the hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan. And on top of that, you've also got the fact that he was unaware of the fact that Trump took those documents in Mar-a-Lago after his presidency, which I think is pretty incompetent. But other than that, I don't think, I mean, those are pretty bad, don't get me wrong. I'd probably rank him a C tier, but we haven't seen if the consequence of a lot of the things he's done is positive or negative. But overall, a lot better than Trump, a lot he's a lot less extreme, and I do like that he's a lot less of a mudslinger. But in the end, I'm not really the happiest to vote for him for another term. But and I'd probably rather take him. I'd take him over Trump any day. However, let's start things off officially with none other than George Washington, which I will say I'm in a bit of a dilemma if he would be the GOAT over Abraham Lincoln. There's one of those debates as old as time, but got his handling of the Whiskey Rebellion and all those sorts. You got the Dream Team with Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, and that old sort. But overall, I mean, he is basically the one the who did establish the position as a whole. So he did an incredible job in those regards. But I will admit though, obviously you got the slavery issue, which if we were ranking them as people, then he would probably be lower. But this from the standard of a president, which some of the positive elements of his character definitely did end up making it through. But either way, apart from slavery, he was still a pretty impressive leader. And even though he's the only person that the people wanted, even if the elections were very limited at that time, just wealthy white men with property, he was really the only person that people wanted. And people wanted him to be a king, but he refused it, though, because he believed that monarchy is the two-bit system that it is. And I'm pretty glad about that. Next, we have a president that I'll admit I'm no fan. And, well, before I mention, though, with federalism, though, I will have to mention that I am putting John Adams as a D tier, which is a bit of a controversial take, but hear me out. With George Washington, though, he was notoriously bipartisan, and that was one of the best elements of his presidency. However, though, with John Adams, though, he was distinctly Federalist, and I'm not saying that the Democratic Republicans were perfect, but they're a heck of a lot better than the Federalists, if you ask me. Which, even if Washington was a little bit more lenient towards, I don't like the Federalist Party though, because it was just a very elitist party. They opposed the separation of church and state, and the Democratic Republican Party was a little bit more different from how things are now, where they embraced elements of conservatism and liberalism, which now these days it's either just exclusive conservatism or exclusive liberalism, and usually just left-leaning moderate liberalism. But when it comes to the subject of John Adams, though, you got you got his whole Alien Sedition Acts, which did terrible effects for freedom of speech and for immigration, were truly a travesty of American legislation. Which, granted, he was a very smart guy, and I think that there are some great things he did in his lifetime. I mean, he was the first president not to own a slave, but overall, through his political wills, I just didn't like it though. I'm not a fan of the Federalist Party, and glad to say so. Then we got Thomas Jefferson, which I'll admit though, definitely one of the more grisly slave owners in American history. And again, this is not based on character exclusive. If anything, this is more based exclusively off of American politics. However, on that subject, Jefferson was one of the goats, though. Sure, he did have a lot of he did sort of kick the can. I mean, he did seem to kick the can through it, which he wasn't the first to kick the can, but wasn't the first to escalate that can kicking of the issue of slavery to as exponential a point as imagined. Because slavery, though, is really the death of the states' rights issues, though. Because I believe in a good balance of state and federal rights, but you can't compromise slavery, though, because it's true. Because it's no secret how morally egregious and evil slavery as a whole is, whether it's racist or not. And obviously American slavery, extremely racist. But for Jefferson, you got the legendary Louisiana Purchase, though. You got advocating for separation of church and state. And overall, though, he had a lot of great populist values. So I'd say presidential-wise, he is one of the best, but as a person, not so great. As a person, pretty terrible person, but we're ranking more so through the politics, and through politics, he's one of the best. John Adams, I gotta rank him in A tier, though. I mean, he's the father of the Constitution. Some people say that he did start the War of 1812. He did also help prevent it, so it's kind of an Achilles heel of sorts for what really makes the best of the best and the worst of the worst with Mr. Adams. But overall, not someone who's nearly as talked about as much, but I do like Mr. Madison. Was I calling him Adams this whole time? Oh, I'm most terribly sorry, viewers, but Mr. Madison was a mighty fine president. I think that he rode well, and he rode a lot of the good elements of the coattails of Jefferson, and kept a lot of that more democratic Republican style, which I'm more of a fan of historically. Then we got James Monroe. I'd probably have to put him in A tier because, I mean, he was one of the most popular presidents of his era, actually, and while not someone who's nearly as talked about as much, most people do criticize him for a lot. Several people do criticize him for the Monroe Doctrine. However, despite that, he truly was the biggest symbol of the era of good feeling and really kept a good standard of national unity during those times. And believe it or not, was the only person to run uncontested in an election, which granted was due to the fact that only wealthy white men with property were able to vote at that time, but either way, he's still a great president. Now, John Quincy Adams, I'll admit I don't have a huge amount to go off of. He has a lot of the negative tropes of the Federalist Party, but as he was obviously the son of John Adams, but I'll say there's no denying that he is one of the most qualified people to be president in history. He had all sorts of positions of power beforehand. So therefore, I think that a whole lot of that, the fact that he's got all that going for him, and even if it was a very hasty election, a hastier win against Andrew Jackson, though, I think he wasn't half bad. I think could have been better, but I respect the guy, but I don't love him. Andrew Jackson, I put him in C tier last time, but because he did have some really good accomplishments, but I'm sorry. Trail of Tears is just beyond despicable, though. It's one of the worst things that happened on American soil, up there with slavery and Jim Crow and and the lynch mobs. But Andrew Jackson, though, you've got the literal Trail of Tears? What's there to say? You've got what's otherwise a literal Native American genocide, which We had done so before. He wasn't the only person to do so, but so many of these were based on broken promises, relocating natives, and just kicking them out of their homes without fair agreements. It was truly evil, and the effects clearly are still lingering on today. And on top of that, you still got the handling of the national bank, which is simultaneously a lot of the positive elements and the negative elements of Mr. Jackson. Because I will admit, I I will say, probably if I were at the time, I would have supported the abolition of the national bank, as it was a major source of elitism. And I do like that he was a more populist figure. He promoted a lot of Jeffersonian populism in the state, as he was able to let all white men be able to vote. So adding white suffrage was pretty good, though. It doesn't sound like much by today's standards, but for the era, it was absolutely massive and was a big step forward in voting rights. And on top of that, you've also got he did heavily rebel against a lot of those elitist and cronyist types, so that's pretty good. But in the end, he was too opposed to the national bank, which, despite the elitist nature, is still very important. We do need a federal state. We do need some federal power in our banking world. Um, he completely opposed that to a point that was unsustainable, and it was only till in 1913 when the notorious unspoken character established the Federal Reserve. And plus, of course, states' rights Republican, which I think, more that I think about it with Monroe, I got to put him at the bottom. Not really because of the Monroe Doctrine, but you got the Compromise of 1820, and that was a dreadful piece of legislation. That was really what kept the can soaring down way by, because by that point, you had to compensate with one slavery state and one free state, which is a wretched compromise because number one, you're compromising with literal slavery, involuntary servitude, and number two is the fact that that not is barely even that much compromise because it's still establishing new slave states. So even if you wanted to compromise it, which you absolutely shouldn't, it's an evil idea because it's little slavery. That's still over there is kind of breaking the compromise because you're adding even if you're making states that are free states, you're still adding states to have slaves. That's pretty dreadful. So even with all the good things I did, even with having some of the positive elements, I still got to put Monroe in the B tier. And with Jackson being a states' rights pro-slavery guy, I got to put him in D tier. Even with those good things about him, they just don't overshadow the literal Trail of Tears and supporting slavery and putting the country in a lot of financial unrest at that. But on one happy good note, though, I will say his biggest accomplishment is undeniably being able to pay off the entire national debt. Yes, he's the only president to have done so, and and knowing how much people in Washington these days spend on absolutely everything, that's probably never going to happen, or at least within my lifetime, or at the very least in the next 30 years or 20 years. That is not going to happen, given how Washington has been for so long. Martin Van Buren, not much I know about this guy for someone who knows so much about presidential history, but he's just kind of a C-tier president, I'll say. Nothing impressive, but didn't do as much that was uniquely awful that I can say. I think he did have some bad effects race-wise, but I don't remember as many of them, so I reckon he's a lucky fellow. Now, Harrison, the thing is that there's been a lot of debate actually whether his speech did give him pneumonia or not, though, because of that code. But either way, though, a lot of people believe that President Harrison had actually died from drinking contaminated water, though, in the White House. So I'd say that most of his presidency was just an outrageously long speech and little else. It's a good example of an Albert Einstein quote. The only ones who don't make any mistakes are the ones who didn't do anything. And that's kind of the best way to sum up President Harrison. Pretty unremarkable beyond his speech because there was so little of his presidency, so how can you really judge? Now, here's a guy that I probably might want to put in D tier later on, but for now, he's so notoriously awful, though, that I had to put John Tyler in here. You know that he was a bad president when it was literally nicknamed his accidency. And he was one, and despite being a member of the Whig, who wasn't a very pro-slavery party to begin with, he was actually pretty pro-slavery, though. He sided with most of the pro-slavery issues just for the sake of compromise on that terrible issue. So, given those regards, I probably got to put him in F tier because of that and his incompetency. I might want to put him in D tier later, but I'm considering F tier because not only that, but the people at the time, especially his party, reviled this chap. So I think that due to his unpopularity with the people and his support in catering to pro-slavery dominions, I'm probably gonna put him in F tier. Ooh, sorry about that. Anyways, I'll probably put James K. Polk in B tier though, because I will say he is a very important. Because I will say though that James K. Polk is one of the most underrated presidents in a lot of ways because nobody talks about him. I mean, nobody. I find it shocking how many people don't know James K. Polk despite how important he was. I mean, he was able to have one of the greatest expansions of the U.S. since none other than the Louisiana Purchase. But then again, that is all wrapped up through manifest destiny, and he picked various unconstitutional ways of utilizing his plans. So while he was truly one to live up to his promise, which is not very common in Washington these days, I don't. I think, frankly, that James K. Polk James K. Polk was not a very good guy, but he was still an impressive guy, though. I'll say that much. And a lot of his means of conquering through Mexico were very unconstitutional. In fact, fun fact about his conquering of Mexico, his vice president, George M. Dallas, is actually the namesake of the city of Dallas, Texas, which, of course, and Polk himself, his legend, is already, I would say, still underrated, is more so untalked about than underrated, but I'm putting him at B because he's more so an impressive president than he was one that I really think was a genuinely incredible president. Because I don't really agree with a lot of his stances, with the exception of his tariff policies, but he was a very important president, though I think he deserves more recognition for what he was able to accomplish. Now, Zachary Taylor, I got to put him in D tier because while he was the last president to own slaves, and while he did approve of California being a non-slave state, that doesn't mean he was a good president. Certainly not. He had no political experience, which made him an utter disappointment, though, in the office. So, which, with Zachary Taylor, he was mostly unimpressive as he only had 1 year, but even with the support for California, that was still put in through the compromise policy of deciding which slaves would be slave states and free states. And that's kind of the worst way to advocate for something noble, I would say. It's advocating for anti-slavery nobility through the worst ways imaginable. That's by compromising on the issue. But in the end, I don't think he was really a good president. He was the last one to own slaves in his presidency. But He was just an incompetent guy who did cater to a lot of it. He was just elected solely because of his status as a war hero rather than as a good politician. Now Millard Fillmore managed to be a lot worse. Oof. I mean, why, you may ask? You got supporting the Compromise of 1850, that is, which is most infamous for its notorious act with the Runaway Slave Act, which had enforced slavery into non-slavery territories by forcing people who were involved in the Underground Railroad to get slaves. And that over there was absolutely wretched. And it was truly just miserable to see him really kick down the can this much with his presidency. Anyways, farewell, viewers of the Macho Man Real Estate channel. We shall pick up this excellent presidential banter, and have a swell day. See you for part 2.